Welcome to For the Love of Books, Bees Books Edition, a podcast by North Lanarkshire Libraries.
Hello, this is Pari.
And this is Jenny, and we're here to talk about
Bees books. This time I wanted to try out because every time you've introduced Bees books, I've always felt like jumping in, like it sounds like, one of those old-timey cartoon catchphrases.
No, I quite like that. Yeah.
So I caught you completely by surprise, which is, sometimes it helps to keep the relationship fresh.
Does, yes.
So, the theme that Bee gave us today feels particularly apt for today's weather because it feels like proper autumn has come when we're recording.
Yes.
I had a real struggle getting out of bed today. So
it's definitely getting that time of year when we want to turn into polar bears and hibernate.
Yeah, and what is it? In a couple of Sundays, it's going to get darker because the clocks
change.
Something happens. So, in India, this doesn't happen. We don't have daylight savings time. So when I came here, it was the first time that I'd ever encountered it, and it feels a bit like magic to me.
It is magic.
Yes.
Strange magic. Yes.
And I don't quite know how it works, but I'm just like, yes, we have lost an hour. Yes, we have gained an hour. Magic.
I like this one though because it's backwards, so you get an extra hour in bed.
Oh, do you?
Whereas in the spring, it's forward, and you kind of feel as if you've lost something.
But here, it's like you're being sort of prepped for the darkness that is to come. So like, ooh, extra hour in bed, and then it's dark all the time.
Yes.
Which is a great time for the theme that Bee gave us, which is something spooky. Nice! We're full of surprises today. So, this one, I'm not usually a spooky book reader or a spooky movie watcher, but it's something about this time of year that I want to get into the mood. Like with Christmas, you want to read festive things. Over the last couple of years, I've been trying and reading spooky things. And so, first I want to find out what your book is.
Okay, so I'm the same. I'm not a big scary movie type person. So I went down the classic route. And I chose The Strange Case of Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde. Which I didn't know was actually a short story, not a full book, so it's only like that many pages. And it's one of those ones I think everybody kind of knows the general story. There's been so many adaptations, but actually reading it was a wee bit different. So I'm interested to tell you about that.
I can't wait.
But I want to know what you chose.
Well, I've chosen 2 books and a podcast.
Excellent.
I can't remove the podcast out with a flourish, but I do have my spooky book of bags. Spooky bag of books. So my first book is called Through the Woods.
Oh, that's so pretty.
By Emily Carroll. And I know you're not like a super graphic novel person, but this is a book that I think I first read a few years ago. I borrowed it from like a library actually. And I'm just going to show you, and for people who are listening and are interested, they can look for pictures online because it's full. But look at how creepy and beautiful it is.
It is very creepy.
Yeah,
but
and
it's very pretty.
It looks really atmospheric and gothic, and that's kind of what it is. So it's a collection of 5 stories, 5 short stories, and this was her debut novel. So it's about it was in 2014. But it still feels really fresh because of it's like kind of like fairy tale adaptations, but not really. But you recognize a little bit of Grimm Brothers, a little bit of Neil Gaiman, a little bit of Stephen King, gothic sort of. So it's just like a mishmash of this, and just her beautiful and really creepy drawings as well.
From the cover straight away, I had Little Red Riding Hood pop into my head.
Yeah.
I can see it's kind of a spooky foresty type
cover. So all the 5 stories, they're set in or around woods, so like the forest does play a role. So that's the sort of umbrella framework, but you can kind of sense like different influences in this, and it's just a really spooky, perfectly spooky book, I think, to curl up in, not in the dark if you have an overactive imagination, but in the daytime, and it's just really beautiful.
And what's the second book?
So my second book is a little bit left field, shall I say, because before I tell you what the book is, there's a thing that's like I've been haunted by like a ghost, it feels like, for quite a few years now. It's all I can think about. it like freaks me out all the time, but it's something that I feel like I can't talk about with everybody. It's only specific people, so it feels pretty spooky. So, what is spookier or scarier than the existential threat that the climate crisis poses for humans and the planet? So the reason that Jenny is laughing is because the book I'm holding is called The Climate Book, and it's been edited and curated by Greta Thunberg, our climate hero mascot. And this is so I've been reading this book. So this Through the Woods, like I've reread it like last year, but I haven't read it more recently. This one I've been reading over the last few weeks. And it's just made me really depressed, Jenny. I don't know what to tell you. It's very scary. It's a little bit like, well, I'll talk to you more about the comparisons. I was thinking of like scary movies and the horror that is the climate crisis. But yes, I thought this was an apt and a surprising book.
Definitely surprising. I want to point out as well, the cover, if you took away created by Greta Thunberg at the bottom, even just the climate book and the cover is actually quite scary. I can picture that like with a different title on it being kind of quite a scary book. So in a strange way, I can...
That's really interesting because, I thought, so the cover is like, it's like stripes of blues and oranges and whites. And I thought it looked quite friendly.
Oh.
Yeah. So, and like there's like, it's like beautifully produced as well. So I'm just turning the pages for Jenny. It's a collection of short essays, and I'll talk to you a little bit more about this. But there's like photos and things as well. And there's this one photo that I was looking at, which is just gorgeous. The sea and like rainbow things on the sea. And it was the oil spill, the worst oil spill in the world that's happened, that's killed like the biodiversity of the region.
However,
I was just like,
we're both optimistic people, so we do see the rainbows where other people might see...
That's true.
Oil slicks.
Yeah, yes. And it's just so like, I thought that but I love your interpretation of it, because I suppose like I framed it for spooky season, so now it can be quite, is this a wildfire? Is this the planet burning? Is
like
this all of us dying?
Stephen King's Carrie, just across the middle of that, with those colours, it kind of, to me, that kind of
love
goes,
that.
I like that.
Yeah,
like a kind of modern cover of an older book.
Absolutely.
I
love that. Okay, so tell me about your book, and because mine's super depressing.
Yes.
So,
so, The Strange Case of Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde. I think everybody knows the story that there's this doctor, Dr. Jekyll, who experiments with things to try and change his personality, and a bad person comes out of that, and it's like that kind of a thing. There's been loads and loads of different interpretations on the television, things like that, but reading the short story, it's kind of set in Victorian London, and straight away you get that whole kind of pea super mess. You expect Jack the Ripper to jump out at you at any point. It's very atmospheric, and for all that it's written so long ago, and it is a short story, you still do feel that kind of like you want to kind of look over your shoulder, and it's basically the main character is a lawyer who knows Dr. Jekyll through various things, and it progresses from him finding out about this Mr. Hyde, because he's the one that does the will for Dr. Jekyll, and the will is very strange. It says, if I die, everything goes to Mr. Hyde. If I disappear for 3 months or more, everything goes to Mr. Hyde. So Mr. Utterson, the lawyer, kind of thinks, is there something in this? Is he, is Mr. Hyde know about this? Is he going to kill Dr. Jekyll? Because he doesn't know it's the same person at that point. But you kind of, as you progress through the story, you realise that it is the same person. And basically... Oh,
that's really interesting.
In the story, it kind of explains that a wee bit more than any version I've seen.
Yeah.
And that Dr. Jekyll couldn't... he has two sides to him, like everybody does, and most people, they kind of put their bad side, in their head, the nasty things they want to say about people or whatever, they kind of put that to the back. He can't marry those two together, so what he's trying to do is take away the bad part of him, to kind of go and do, because he's quite happy for him to go and do bad things and leave the better part behind. So he does this through various experiments, using very weird and wonderful things that look very fabulous on screen, lots of test tubes and things like that. And Mr. Hyde is the bad part of him. When he comes out, he's younger and he's smaller and he's quite malformed in his way, because he is the bad part of him. And the first time you kind of realise that he is bad is basically he walks down the street, a kid runs out in front of him and he tramples over the kid and just keeps going. So he doesn't have that
moral compass of any sort.
Yeah. And then, you know, there's not pitchforks or anything, but, you know, the local people go, hold on a minute. So he kind of realises he's done something wrong. He goes and he gets a big cheque for the family to kind of pay them off and say sorry, but really he's just paying them off. And the cheque is drawn as Dr. Jekyll. So things start kind of coming together. And then there's a big murder. And again, obviously this is Mr. Hyde. His bad parts come out and he's done this. It's not really explained why he does it to this particular person. I'm sure, you know, there's probably a backstory there somewhere. And then it all comes to a head. And basically he doesn't need the potion anymore for Mr. Hyde. So, and basically he starts turning into him all the time. He kind of wakes up and he's him and he's not quite sure what's happened the night before, kind of a thing. And
that's so fascinating and horrifying.
Yes. Now there's obviously a lot behind this story. You know, there's a big bit at the beginning that kind of gives you, you know, pointers and things like that, and it's kind of talking about, as you say, moral compasses and you know, the Victorian era, you know, how they felt about certain things. And I think Victorians were kind of quite repressed in their way, and this was kind of
a way to like break those shackles.
But yeah, it was a story I read in one go at night, with the light very much on.
That, like, I love that, because, like, you're absolutely right. I knew nothing about the story. I don't think watched any adaptations of it. It's just, but it's such a part of the cultural consciousness with Dr. Jekyll and Dr. Hyde, just because I don't even know when I first heard of it. It's like, it's always there, and you sort of find an entry point into it. And of course, it immediately made me think of the Hulk from the Marvel movies, because, you know, like, that's become this sort of current cultural, like, mainstream thing. And also really interesting when you talked about how he wants the bad parts to be divorced from him. But in the Marvel movies, like with Hulk and what's his name, the Doctor as well, who has
Bannerman?
Bruce Bannerman, who has a ridiculous number of PhDs. He has 7 PhDs. Do you know how long it takes to get one PhD?
He obviously started when he was 12 or
something. But like, he, I think, sort of has to learn how to coexist with, like, it's less monstrous. Like, it starts off like, oh, he's this monster and angry and whatever, but he has to learn that he's actually a part of me, and how you learn to live with that, which obviously in this I don't think
he never got there. He never kind of worked out how he has to live with both of them.
But I also wonder how much this influenced, you know, these, because this is like an old book, and at that time I'm sure it was shockingly modern, and like, even in terms of, you know, like with Frankenstein as well, like all these things that were science fiction, but now it's like, oh, this old-timey sort of thing. But at that time, like the Victorian or pre-Victorian thing, it must have been like just sort of like the imaginations of people, how it must have shifted.
I imagine, you know, somebody reading this in 1868 or whenever it was published was quite taken aback by it. And the way these things are written, even if you read a Jane Austen, a lot of the stuff references stuff that's happening at that time.
Absolutely.
And it's kind of lost on people reading things now unless they know the history. I think it's the same with this. I think if you knew more about that era and what was going on, you know, politically and socially, I think you would possibly realise there's even more to it than you get out of it. But knowing nothing, you know, you still read it and it's still
exactly, because
a good
your
story.
current sort of political, social, cultural things, or how either they've changed or things that have been the same, or just think, you know, it's just like such an interesting way to think through that with a book like this. Like even like things like moral compasses and things, like you see so much, like in the climate book, you know, where they're talking about some people have absolutely zero, like even in the sense that, like, maybe not like you're not murdering somebody in front of you, but actually you're murdering the future and the planet. Yeah, so, you know, just it's I would think this would be an excellent book for like a book club or a discussion sort of thing, because different people would be bringing different things into it. Oh, it sounds fascinating. I think I wanna read it, Jenny.
Some of the other stories in it as well, I kind of dipped into them. Some of them are only a few pages long, you know, they're very short stories. But that one, you know, is the one that people know. It's like Christmas Carol is actually a short story, you know, but there's been so many adaptations of it that you think of it as being a bigger story than it is, if that makes sense.
But even the way that it is in this book, it doesn't say it's a collection of short stories on the cover. It just says it's a strange case of Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde, and then it's like a fattish, not fat, but it's like a sort of regular sized book, I think.
And that is all that the story is.
That is, yeah. Oh, so they're like, oh wait, we're getting you in through this, but you have to work through.
And obviously Robert Louis Stevenson was Scottish, so though this is set in London, you still kind of get that. But some of the other short stories are kind of some of them are like spooky stories as well, and they're set in Scotland at different times. There's one about a witch and things like that.
Oh wow.
And I might go back and kind of dip into them again. But they do leave that story to the last. So that you kind of like feel as if you have to read everything else to get there. But yes, to come back to Bee's whole point, it was quite spooky. It did kind of leave you going, oh.
So I think the atmospheric nature of it, that's what I really liked about Through the Woods as well, because there isn't, like, it's very much a suggestion of things, you know, it's like implied, obviously it's like visually represented, but it's like a lot of the work you're doing, even though it's a graphic novel, the imagination and the spookiness comes from what you're imagining. I think a lot of horror, like good horror, I think does that. Like you're
it
not being
behind the scenes, doesn't it, in your imagination?
Yeah, and like nothing that somebody else would write for definite would match up to all the different things that you imagine, you know. So, and that's what I really like. So of course there's like really creepy illustrations and stuff. Some of it is quite gory, but most of it is through the colors, like lots of blacks and reds and this atmospheric nature of it, which is really beautiful. So which is why, and like just a bit unsettling at some points, and then you're just like waiting to see what happens. I would absolutely recommend. We have a copy of this in the library, not in Coatbridge, but you can request it. So yeah, I would for sure recommend this.
It is a lovely cover. And you said before that it's kind of influenced by people like Grimm, and people forget that the Brothers Grimm's original stories were not the sugar-coated ones that we have now.
And like they served a different purpose. They are like exactly like at that time, because it was more oral storytelling and it was more like sharing knowledge through stories in a very real way. So you don't want to go out into the woods by yourself because you don't know what's there, you don't, and like people, strangers, all the sort of social cultural norms of that time came through in these stories. And it's a little bit of that, so it's a little bit like old-fashioned but also modern, which I feel like the book, like Jekyll and Hyde also sounds a bit like, even though it is old, it can be made new again, which is really interesting. So now I shall come to talk about, I've taken a deep breath. So it's something, like I said, I am like completely very sort of terrified by what's happening going on in the world, and I am usually a really optimistic person, but sometimes thinking about it, just especially this book, so it's like a collection, it's 5 sections, and I very much skimmed over like the first couple of sections because they were too scientific for me. Like I like narratives, and I'm like convinced of the science. I don't need to be like, I don't need proof. I'm like yeah, but
they know what they're talking
yeah,
about.
exactly.
So,
like yes,
yeah.
I believe you. But for other people, they might like to know the science, the graphs, the stats, which is all. For me, it was like it's really boring, which is unfortunate. But then the last three were like people from all over the world. So Greta Thunberg used her name and her sort of I guess popularity and her connections to invite different kinds of peoples, right? So they could be climate activists, they could be students, they could be scientists, they could be
lots of different
journalists,
voices.
lots of different voices from different parts of the world, including parts of the world that are going through the climate crisis. So it's not a future thing. It's like it's affecting them now. And also how they're like, for example, one of them was Bangladesh, which is really close to the country that I'm from, India. Like we're just neighbors, but the sort of poverty levels and the deprivation is really stark there. But the kinds of things that their people are doing to prepare actually feels much more forward than things that are happening here. Like if something like the floods that happened a couple of weeks ago, if that was our reality every sort of like day, we're not, I don't think we're prepared for.
We're definitely not.
Yeah,
we're definitely not.
So whereas in that case, because they've had to, so it's like a whole thing. It's community, it's government, and it talks about like different examples like that as well. But it's like really depressing because I mean I guess it's a sort of like the narrative is like depressing. Hope ? Because it talks about, so like the comparison that I had when I was reading this to a horror movie is like, in the beginning in horror movies, when people go off by themselves,
yes.
They're usually the first people to die.
Yes.
But
and you just shout at them.
Exactly. You're like, have you not watched horror movies before? Do you not know you're not supposed to? But that's what like it talks about, that you need to work with not just like your country or city or state or whatever, but like globally, like, and you need to work with people, which is what a lot of the examples here were, like, because it can feel so impossible. Like what is one person doing, like, when there's like the top sort of 1% of people who are taking private jets every day, or like, just like doing things that we would never, like in our whole lives, we have like carbon budgets and all this thing is nonsense. But there are lots of examples, well, not a lot. There are a few examples of people actually coming together and working in different ways, and sort of like, I found it less hopeful than the podcast that I want to talk about, which is called How to Save a Planet. Which I love. I feel like that is such a... I mean, I guess this was accessible to certain degrees, but it just completely wiped my mental... Like, I had to go to Pollock Country Park in Glasgow on Saturday and cuddle some Highland cows to heal myself. To, like, look at the autumnness of the trees and, like, the beauty, and just, like, people, and be like, oh my God, yeah, we have some things to say.
I think you always need hope. Even if you're watching a horror movie or something, there's always that bit of hope.
Yeah.
That, this doesn't.
Somebody will. What? So like that's the thing. I think that Greta Thunberg doesn't really believe in passive hope, and like it's like she's created the book and she's edited it, and her sort of editorials kind of interspersed throughout the book, and she does make that really clear. She's like, I don't think we have time for hope. It'll get better without everybody doing something about it in whatever ways they can, which I do agree with to a certain extent. But in How to Save a Planet, so you can listen to it on like Spotify or whatever, it's free. And it was started by a journalist, Alex Bloomberg, and a marine biologist, Ayana Elizabeth Johnson, I want to say, might be wrong, but that one talks about, so I'll read you the basically their pitch for it, because that one makes me actually feel much more hopeful. Because so it says, climate change, we know it can feel too overwhelming, but what if there was a show about climate change that left you feeling energized, one so filled with possibility that you actually wanted to listen? Join us, journalist Alex Bloomberg, and a crew of climate nerds as we bring you smart, inspiring stories about the mess that we're in and how we can get ourselves out of it.
See, that sounds hopeful. That sounds kind
exactly.
of... We can do things.
Yeah, and like it's sort of... It's a way of, just like it doesn't sort of sugarcoat things. It doesn't say, like, it, sort of explored one of the episodes about recycling and how most stuff that we recycle doesn't get recycled. But that's not to say you shouldn't recycle, but that's to say that you need to, like, vote people that who share your ethos or whatever, or like, write to your MPs, like. But they have all these actionable things that they like talk about, and they're like, not everybody needs to do everything, because that would completely drain you out. Like, not everybody needs to go be like at a protest. So like, there's different ways that you can contribute, and talking about it. So I find it very difficult to talk about the climate crisis because of how much I'm freaked out by it. So I thought this was a good platform to start.
Yes.
Just like, I mean, it might be a really small platform in terms of, how many people listen, how many people will even like be interested. But I think it's like my one step to want to, like, I want to share online, but it just feels so personal, but it's not, obviously, because it's impacting so many people. But it's like also, I think, a topic that's really, it shouldn't be, but it can be really controversial, because either people don't want to listen because they're like, this is just like sort of for people who like don't have anything better to do or whatever, or they're like, oh, it's too impossible, so I just want to ignore it, which I understand both ways. So, which is why I think like this book, it would be good for someone who's already, I guess, convinced and wants to sort of look at different voices, because it is a lot from like different countries. So it's not just the UK and the US and Sweden, but like different countries and how people are managing and what they're thinking about. I think that's really interesting. But I think the podcast is a super accessible way for people who might be like, okay, I'll give it a shot, I suppose, and like I'll see what people have to say, but are not fully like committed one way or the other. And listening to those voices in a way that's more, I think, approachable, and how, if you want to join in, you can. And they make it, like, obviously there is, like, it's serious, but it's also, there's room for joy and laughter and fun and hope, which is what I think. So, like, this is something that I'd researched for my PhD, which I only have one of, not 7, like Bruce Banner. But, like, hope punk is this sci-fi genre, science fiction and fantasy genre, which is basically like, it's a micro genre, which is basically like, okay, the world is terrible, but there are still people trying to make it better. And there's not going to be this one end of utopia where everything is going to get fixed and everybody's going to be happy. There's always going to be something. So it's just finding ways to work together in ways that work for everybody, and sort of. So like, I feel like that podcast is a very hope punk podcast. And it is, and like, I think being a potted plant would very much appreciate the world being saved for little bees.
Absolutely.
So,
I think, as you say, it's not one person's going to make a change. Everybody's going to have to play their part, but it can be difficult to find that part that you can play.
Absolutely.
And I do also think personally, it needs to be bigger companies that are looking at things. So I like the Formula One. Formula One is trying to become carbon neutral. And things like that. It needs to be on a big scale like that, as well as the smaller people.
Exactly.
Like cutting out plastic bottles in your bathroom and things like that. Use soap instead of shower gel. We can do, but we can't, as an individual, create such big things to happen just by ourselves. So.
Especially because we're not responsible for like, even in rich countries, like, the UK is a rich country and Scotland is a rich country, but even within it, the wealth is not equally distributed and the power is not equally distributed. So it is, but I suppose, like, what I really like about the podcast, and like the book has that as well towards the end, is that more people, for like, the more people that this matters to, and they're talking about it in different ways, not just in like, I don't like the kind of activism that says my way or no way, like you have to follow this way. I don't think that's very welcoming of people who you want to welcome into the movement. But this is more like, let's figure this out together, and there's room for different beliefs, there's room for different kinds of ways of doing things. but we're just like, I guess changing the mainstream cultural imagination through whatever way. This is a very small way, but it's a step, like maybe there's somebody who's listening who's like, I thought I was alone, I thought I was the only one worrying about the climate.
Exactly. And it is to bring it back to B's, topic, it is scary stuff, not as scary possibly as immediate scariness like a horror movie, but it's I think it's in the back of everybody's mind, so
being haunted by the ghost of the climate crisis. So this is a way to like fight back. Like I'm getting all the people together. I'm like, no, don't go off by yourself. We need to figure this out together.
Yes.
But yes, so that's my book for today. I think B should be pretty happy with our very different interpretations.
Absolutely, I think she will be.
So do you know what? Do you have any news about next time's episode?
So I think she's a bit fed up with us talking about retellings and things like that. So she's going to give us a whole episode on reimagine retellings, so that we can talk about things that we like.
Incredible.
So I'm sure the one after that will not be as kind to us.
Yeah. Well, we already talked about retellings a bit, like the Hulk retelling,
absolutely.
and this one as well, Through the Woods, like sort of, kind of like you can see a little bit of Bluebeard, a little bit of things. So yeah. Oh, I can't wait. This is gonna be, I think, my favorite. It might be my favorite episode, unless I choose a depressing book and depress
Please
both
don't
of
choose
us.
a depressing book. No more climate change books. Thanks very much.
Every other episode of like wholesome depressing. Yeah. But yes, it was lovely chatting with you, Jenny, as always.
Yep.
And bye.
Bye.